he said. And there we go. And a few bits of introduction. Again, welcome. As you just heard, we'll be recording. So feel free to mute your camera if you don't want to be in that recording. But we do ask you if you could please rename yourself with at least your first name, just so that we know who everybody is in the room. The chat is open, but please use it sparingly. I'll be watching it in case there's anything you need from me, but we'd also like it not to become a parallel conversation. And if it gets too overwhelming, it can sometimes be distracting. Please mute yourselves until the Q&A part. And when we get to the question and answer portion, it's easiest if you use the raise hand feature so we can take questions in the order that the hands went up. You can find that by going to the lower control panel, assuming you're on a laptop, and choosing reactions, and then you'll see raise hand, and that will put a little hand up, and it'll bump you to your place in the queue. And finally, we hope to have an engaging evening, but the hosts will be monitoring things throughout, and we'll try and respond as quickly as we can if anything is disruptive or problematic, which trusting it won't be. And so a little introduction of Peter Bolland, who is the Philosophy and Humanities Department Chair at Southwestern College, where he teaches world religions, Asian philosophy, world mythology, and ethics. He also writes a column for Unity magazine and is the author of the upcoming book, 7 Stone Path, An Everyday Journey to Wisdom. A frequent guest speaker at many religious and spiritual communities, including Unitarian, New Thought, and other progressive churches. He also offers in-person and online workshops around the country on the many ways the insights from the world's wisdom traditions enhance and enrich our everyday lives. His blog, YouTube channel, and online guided meditations attract a worldwide following. You can learn more about Peter at peterbolland.com. And it is my pleasure to hand it over to Peter Bolland. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. Wow, I sound busy. That is a lot of stuff. I appreciate the gracious introduction, and hello, everyone, and greetings. I'm so thrilled and honored to be in this space with you and to be sharing this important inquiry. And I'm talking while I'm looking for my PowerPoint, and I'm going to go ahead and just put that up on the screen from the beginning there. And I don't mean to take up time with Zoom tutorials, but if you want, you can switch to speaker view, or if you're on gallery view still, you can reduce the number of tiles that you see so that you can see the slide better by just reducing it to 1, and then you'll see me. Or you can hide my video altogether and just turn me into an audio program. That's fine with me. Let's see, I'm going to hide the floating meeting controls. Good deal. Okay. So I do want to create it, like Tony said, an engaging inquiry into this really hot button issue. To me, abortion is kind of like racism, or it's kind of like discussing slavery and the history of slavery, or the history of the indigenous people's genocide in this country. These are complicated issues. They're very nuanced issues. We're all very aware that it's no longer just, are you for abortion or against abortion? None of these binaries work anymore. And yet in what passes for public discourse around these questions, I'm afraid it is often reduced to an up or down vote. And that leaves a lot of us just really frustrated and sometimes angry. And so it occurred to me when the Supreme Court did what it did last fall, we kind of had a seismic shift, and the Roe v. Wade law that many of us had been quite familiar with for many, many decades went away. And a lot of the conservative states, of course, had trigger laws in place. And so literally within 24 hours, abortion access dried up significantly in the United States in upwards 26, 27 states. And that was just the beginning. That was just the first 24 hours. In the weeks and months now that have followed, abortion access, excuse me, continues to erode and vanish and evaporate before our very eyes, leaving some of us wondering, wow, what happened? We really we really seems like somebody was asleep at the wheel or something. And who wasn't asleep at the wheel was the Federalist Society and all of these long game, right-wing, conservative, religious conservative groups, Christian groups, starting from Phyllis Schlafly and Jerry Falwell, and going all the way back to the Reagan era. Ever since then, they've been figuring out how to overturn Roe v. Wade. And to put it bluntly, they won. And so now we live in a post-Roe v. Wade world. And this little building here, the Supreme Court, I know you all recognize it. Many of you have been inside it like I have, not as an attorney perhaps, but as a tourist. It's really something to be in that room, isn't it? And so that is the context that kind of drove me to put this talk together. Already as early as last summer, on June 24th is when the ruling came down. It happens to be my birthday. That's why I remember the date. So I thought, you know what? I'm a philosophy guy. I don't really want to get on some venue like this and tell everybody, hey, here's what Peter Bolland thinks, because as fascinating as I would find that's not helpful to anybody. So what I would rather do is ask, in a philosophical way, some foundational questions about what I think are the hidden assumptions inside a lot of the positions that are being taken by activists on both sides. And so I thought, there's a conversation that we're not having. And by now, we're all quite familiar with the wide range of positions on abortion. We're not going to get into all of them here. And ever since Roe v. Wade became the law in 1973, and for long before, there's been a battle, hasn't there? That's raged throughout our political and religious landscape. But what's been missing is a deeper examination of the often hidden philosophical claims that support those many positions on abortion, and an examination of the way those underlying philosophical positions intersect and sometimes conflict with one another. So that's another thing I'm hoping to accomplish today. And so let's do the work tonight of unpacking all of this and see if we can't get a little closer to understanding the philosophy of abortion. And it isn't just one position, is it? I mean, look at this photo, same building, and you have all these signs. I've been a guy at rallies holding signs, but always aware that subtle discourse is not accomplished with cardboard and paint. It's pretty important to vote with your feet and to get out there and show your body and signal what matters and use the media in your favor. That's what all activists do, and that's what these street protests are about. And if you're scanning these signs, you're seeing the whole range of positions. My favorite is that Mock People magazine with Kavanaugh as sexiest man alive. So you've got the abortion is murder, repent or perish people. You got the keep abortion legal people. Abortion is a human right. Healthcare is a human right. So those are some of the main slogans that we've all been swimming in for all our lives, actually. So let's take a moment before we get into the deeper tissue of these things and just sort of check in with what some of the various positions are around abortion. Here's one: the claim that life begins at the moment of conception, therefore all abortions are murder. So this is a position held by the Roman Catholic Church, and we'll get into these numbers later, this is a position that is not held by a majority of American Catholics. We'll tease that apart later. But this is the official position of many in the Catholic Church and throughout the evangelical community. So for them, it's very simple, right? Sometimes envy the simplicity of positions like this. I wish it were that easy for me, because there's just no nuance here at all. It's like at the moment that a sperm cell permeates the membrane of an ovum, before it's even attached to the uterine wall, right? That's why they call it the abortion pill. All the pill does is prevent uterine wall attachment. So all these medical nuances are just banished by simplicity like this. That's one view. They, of course, would oppose any and all abortion. And let me pause for it. Let me go back. These are the states that don't have exceptions. These are the states that want to criminalize abortion. Here's another one, a little different. Life begins at conception, but abortion is justified when the life of the mother is threatened. Okay, so there's a little nuance thrown into essentially an anti-abortion stance that say, well, if it's the sort of pregnancy that is medically threatening the life of the mother, then that termination can be permitted because women have the right to life too. A third position might be described this way, that life begins at conception, but abortion is justified if the pregnancy is the result of a violent crime like rape and or if the pregnant person is a girl. So there are a couple of other nuances that some anti-abortion people allow into their consideration. Here's a fourth possible position. Abortion is okay. It's authorized. It's morally justifiable up to a certain point in the pregnancy when the fetus is viable outside the womb, under a certain number of circumstances. So that's kind of the Roe v. Wade stance. There was that viability language. And well, here's a sort of a subcategory of that position. Abortion is okay prior to viability if both partners agree. Some people wouldn't want to consider what that is just the woman's choice, and the male partner need not be a part of the deliberation. That seems to be a further distinction. Number 6, abortion is okay at any point during the pregnancy if the fetus is not viable. That's one we haven't put on the list yet. Here's another one. 7, abortion is okay prior to viability if the mother wants it. So in other words, at the discretion of the mother, at any point during prior to viability. Here's another one. Abortion is okay at any point during the pregnancy at the discretion of the couple or the mother. Maybe that's not as common as numbers 7 and 6 would be, but people who tend to be against abortion think that everybody on the pro-choice side is at number 8. So as you can see, and I guess my point for putting all this up is when you're talking about abortion, good or bad, you're not really even getting close to what the reality of the difficulty of this nuanced issue is about. So that's one thing to get sorted out. These are all entanglements. As we can see with that quick survey of the abortion landscape, there are numerous metaphysical, epistemological, ethical, religious, sociological, economic, and medical issues entangling with one another. Access to abortion is an economic issue, isn't it? It's a socioeconomic issue. By metaphysical issue, I mean metaphysics in philosophy means considerations of what is reality. And so what is a human being is a metaphysical question. And clearly you have metaphysical positions being taken on that previous slide about what a human being is. And then you have, in my business philosophy, we have this other big word called epistemology. You have epistemological challenges. If someone claims that a fertilized zygote is a human being, I have an epistemological question for you. How do you know? By what criteria do you establish the claim that a zygote is a full human being? By what evidence do you fortify or justify that truth claim? You're free to believe that, but I mean, how can you demonstrate it for the rest of us? So that's what I mean by kind of getting under the basic positions into the philosophy of abortion. So untangle this knot is, of course, a Herculean task. So let's do what we can in the time we have by just starting with a few observations. Let's start with the big metaphysical question. What is a person? Isn't that at the heart of this whole thing? The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which, by the way, was not written by the framers in the 1780s. It came later during Reconstruction, after after the Civil War. So the Civil War ended in 1865, and in Washington, D.C., they got busy. trying to figure out what to do to bring the secessionist southern states back in, et cetera, et cetera. And so this amendment passed, the 14th Amendment. It has a lot to say about who is a person. It is, in fact, it's from the 14th Amendment that we get the oft repeated assertion that we have a right to life. Sure, Jefferson mentions that in passing in the Declaration of Independence of 1776, that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it isn't, as we probably know, the Declaration of Independence is not law. It's a letter that we wrote to the British. So here it is codified now in the Constitution. And here's what it actually says. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is a really crazy, big, gnarly, far-reaching amendment, right? There's all kinds of stuff in here to tease apart, but I'm focusing just on that bolded word life there. So the state can't deprive any person of life or liberty or property. And as I mentioned before, this is the idea that is the foundation of many who are opposed to abortion access. They say, we define the fetus as a person. A person has a right to life. Therefore, abortion should be illegal. But as you're seeing, as you read through the 14th Amendment with me, is that what it really says? And what about that next word, liberty? And who gets liberty? And who is protected by it? It also says the state shall not deprive any person of liberty. Oh, and by the way, they can't take your house unless they pay you for it because eminent domain and they need to build a freeway right through your house. So there's all these due process issues. So anti-abortion folks, of course, say that this is the constitutional language that makes abortion illegal. So we still haven't touched the question yet. When does a fertilized egg become a person? I think we all agree that unfertilized ovum coming down the fallopian tube, one every 28 days, we probably agree those aren't people. We probably agree that sperm cells, 10, 20,000 a shot, we probably agree that those aren't people. But when the two get together and the fertilization event occurs, and especially when it attaches to the uterine wall and begins to split into four, et cetera, then now we start to get, okay, now something's on the way. That is going to be a person in a few months. But is it a person now? So let's think about that. Let's think that through. The question of when precisely life begins and ends has long plagued medical science and the legislatures who codify these delineations into law. So we see that in the case of death, let's start there. We see that in the case of death, there is no clear, obvious, hard demarcation point between life and death. Breathing, heartbeat, electrical activity. A person who stops breathing is not dead. A person whose heartbeat has stopped isn't always necessarily dead. Sometimes the electrical activity thing. So the law is kind of vague on that. It's left up to medical professionals in certain prescribed circumstances to determine the moment of death. So too with conception and birth. It isn't clear, really, is it? Let's be real. When life begins, let alone when a microscopic cluster of cells becomes a person. So here's what happens when legislatures and legislators step up. And as you know, because of gerrymandering, a majority of American states are controlled by Republican state houses and Republican governors. Again, very intentionally, a long 40-year campaign to make that happen because they know that's where they can have the farthest reach on this issue. Getting the Supreme Court to go along, that was just frosting on the cake for them and a big coup. That Donald Trump was able to appoint three Supreme Court justices to add to a batch of couple already very Catholic, very conservative justices like Alito. So the writing was on the wall on that November night when Donald Trump got elected. A lot of us interested in abortion access sat back in our chairs and wept because we saw June of 2022 coming, and it came, and here we are. So there's a whole number of states. Let's look at Georgia. They declare that life begins when there is a measurable electrical activity in the cells that will become the heart. Now, they call it a heartbeat, when there is a heartbeat. Many argue that states like Georgia mischaracterize the electrical activity of those tissues as a heartbeat because at 6 weeks, there is not yet a heart. There is no circulatory system being pumped by the heart. So it's clever, isn't it? It's something we pay a lot of attention to in philosophy. Confucius even called it way back 25 centuries ago in China. He called it the rectification of names. We have to call things truthfully and honestly what they are. And when we don't do that, when we do not have rectitude in our naming, then you end up in a kind of quagmire of gibberish that calling the electrical activity a heartbeat is just not right. Call it the electrical activity of tissue that will develop into a heart, but that doesn't fit in the headline. So there's those kinds of things to notice. And it turns out the labels we give to things really make a difference. So now 6 weeks, of course, as y'all know, is before most women even know that they are pregnant. So the 6-week or heartbeat bans are a de facto ban on abortion. And of course, this is understood and intentionally orchestrated by anti-abortion activists. They know damn well that's exactly what's going to happen. This is a way for us to close the door on all abortions. We're not trying to leave some room for some people to have some abortions. They're going for the whole cheese, the big cheese, and that's how they're doing it. So biological occurrences are not events, they are processes, says David Magnus, director of the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics. So when you go to professional philosophers who work for medical boards, medical universities, and so on, like David Magnus, you end up with, I think, a pretty clear truth claim that biological occurrences are not events, they are processes. I'm just recognizing with you the difficulty of making the determination, not a person, a person. When that happens is kind of a gradient scale. So religion picks up where science leaves off. Since science cannot reach a consensus on when life begins or on the definition of person, we turn to religion. And it turns out that the claim that a zygote, a fertilized egg, is a person and is therefore protected by the 14th Amendment is a claim found mainly among Roman Catholics and evangelical Christians. And yet, according to the Pew Research Center, which is really the premier research group into questions surrounding religion, mostly, and a lot of other social issues, according to the Pew Center, a majority of American Christians favor safe and legal abortion access. Even American Catholics, by a slim majority, and very slim, 51 to 49%. 51 to 49% American Catholics favor safe and legal abortion access, much to the horror of their bishops and in defiance of their leaders. So what's happening here? Where is all this opposition coming from? So across the American religious landscape, voters in 3 Christian sects are responsible for the most vigorous abortion opposition: evangelicals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons. Now, the latter 2, Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, are relatively small pieces of the demographic pie, around 2% of the population each. So evangelicals, on the other hand, comprise 30 to 35% of the population and wield, as you know, enormous political influence. So most of the mojo pushing through these restrictions on abortion is coming from the evangelical community and, to a lesser extent, the American Catholic community. So there you go. Now, what about other religions? I thought it might be fun to look at what other religions feel about these issues. In Buddhism and in Judaism, 83% of Americans in those two communities favor abortion in all or almost all cases. In fact, in Judaism, the unborn baby is considered part of the mother's body until it is born and breathing on its own. 73% of unaffiliated or nuns, when you ask people, what religion are you? They check that last box, none. None of the above. In my business, we call them the nuns. 73% of the unaffiliated or nuns favor abortion in all or almost all cases. Interesting, lower than Jews and Buddhists. 68% of Hindus favor abortion in all or almost all cases. 60% of mainline Protestants favor abortion in all, I'm abbreviating here, abortion access in all or almost all cases. And remember, I said you can all have this PowerPoint if you email me at peterbolland.com. There's a lot of numbers you might want to refer to later. So, or feel free to take pictures of the screens as they go by. We get to Islam and we have a little bit of a dip here. 55% of Muslims favor abortion access in all or almost all cases, taking essentially a Jewish woman-centered position. Islam and Judaism very, very close together in so many of their beliefs and practices that the baby is part of the mother's body. The fetus is part of the mother's body until a live birth. So here's a question that occurs to me as I look at all this data. Maybe it's already occurred to you too. Does the evangelical claim that life begins at conception align with the views of most Americans? No, it does not. As we said, 61%, 6 in 10 Americans say, and now I'm going outside the religions, just 6 in 10 Americans in some very good polling have this position that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. How can that be the case considering what's happening? How is it that the minority, this small religious minority, is winning this struggle? So, in opposition to abortion, is opposition to abortion a scientific or a religious claim? So I'm trying to build an argument here. Let's see if I can get to it here. The claim that life begins at conception would appear to be an article of faith, not a demonstrable empirical scientific claim. In other words, a religious belief. The claim that a zygote is a person is a religious belief. It would seem that way to me. And as such, it is certainly protected speech and it is a protected opinion. But is it constitutionally sound to ban abortion, thereby imposing this essentially religious belief held by a minority of us on people of other faith traditions or no faith traditions? Is that fair? Would that not violate the First Amendment of the Constitution, which prohibits the establishment of a state religion? I don't hear anybody asking this question. I read all the editorials. I read everything I can about this issue. I've never heard anybody pose it quite this way. Isn't the assertion that the zygote is a person a religious claim that you're free to hold? But if you're going to wield the power of the American government to impose that religious belief on a majority of people who do not hold that view, what happened to religious freedom? Is not the state now taking a religious position? And the First Amendment, in case you don't recall, says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So individual liberty trumps religious coercion every time. People are, of course, free to believe that abortion is wrong and conduct their own lives in accordance with those views, obviously. But by this line of reasoning, they may not justifiably impose their religious views on others. That surprised me. By the time I worked my way through all of that, I was like, now I'm even more convinced than ever that something's gone sideways here. So let's talk about evangelicals for half a minute here. If most of the anti-abortion energy is coming from the evangelical Christian community, have they always held these views? No, At the time of Roe v. Wade, the very influential Southern Baptist Convention, which we lumped together with evangelicals, they argued in favor of abortion access. They argued pro Roe v. Wade. Yeah, can you believe it? The Southern Baptist Convention was in favor of the Supreme Court ruling Roe v. Wade, protecting abortion access, claiming that protecting women's liberty and dignity and health was more important than protecting the unborn. Evangelical Christianity is not a monolithic thing either. It has changed during our lifetimes tremendously. They also feared increasing state intrusion into private lives. You know, my libertarian friends tend to be pro-choice because they just don't want the federal government or the state government up in anybody's business about anything. So yet in the 80s, in the 1980s, or in the 1980s, remember the 80s? In the 1980s, voices like Phyllis Schlafly and Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority were instrumental in giving form to what was then and still called the religious right. Focus on the family, all that stuff, recruiting even pro-abortion candidates, yeah, you heard me, like Ronald Reagan to their cause. You know, Reagan was a Californio. He came out of Hollywood. He believed in abortion access, but like a good politician, he had to build allyships with powerful people, and Falwell and Schlafly particularly in the room with Reagan bent him to their will, said, all right, if I oppose abortion access, y'all back me? And they said yes. And that's how he beat Jimmy Carter. So in other words, opposition to Roe v. Wade united a wide array of conservative causes into a single extremely powerful caucus. Roe v. Wade built the religious right in the strange yin and yang of political evolution across these decades. So the anti-abortion position became a pillar of the Republican Party, and it was not before that. You may recall Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court justice appointed by Ronald Reagan, barely got approved because she had a long history coming out of Arizona as a Goldwater Republican, working for women's rights, which included access to abortion. That was part of the Republican platform. You know, liberty, freedom, people should have liberty and they should have rights. That seemed Republican to them. It doesn't seem Republican anymore because it is not Republican anymore because of what Falwell and Schlafly were able to do. And they've been working to overturn Roe v. Wade for 49 years, and they just did. So what about women? Let's bring this question now into sharper focus. There is still another crucial element to consider. Anti-abortion voices argue that at the moment of conception, the pregnant person must give birth, right? Coerced birth. You cannot terminate that pregnancy. And if it's an ectopic pregnancy, or if there's a terrible birth defect and the baby's going to be born without a brain or without a spine or in other ways dead, in some states, you can't even abort that fetal tissue. You have to wait until it naturally comes out of the body. So that causes some activists on the other side, on the abortion access side, to say we shouldn't call them pro-life anymore. We should call them forced birth. Coerced birth, the coerced birth movement. So in other words, if you hold that very strict anti-abortion view that at the moment of conception, that's a person, and that the woman cannot terminate that pregnancy, you're basically taking the position that the woman no longer has liberty over her own body. She is essentially a walking around womb. At the moment of conception, the woman loses her autonomy over her own bodily functions. That's the pro-life position. So her liberty rights have been erased by the alleged liberty rights of the fetus and then coerced into giving birth. So my question philosophically is, how can we reconcile this position with the Constitution's full-throated affirmation of personal liberty and the right to pursue one's own happiness. And if you don't have autonomy over your own body, what does freedom even mean? So maybe John Locke can help. So let me take you into the world of 17th century British philosopher John Locke and his discussion of liberty, rights, and private property. So good old Locke, we're going back to 1632, 1704, enormously influential British empiricist. We're gonna skip over his work with epistemology and skip to his work with rights, liberty and rights. That I think that's where he really had the biggest impact. So particularly in terms of the European Enlightenment, the 18th century, and specifically Thomas Jefferson. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he knew his Locke well. And let's see if we can trace that together and then apply it to our issue today, abortion. So here's what Locke does. He makes the case for private property. Let me take you inside of it. So Locke argued that the commons belonged to everyone, but our own bodies belong to us. Now, the commons in his time meant the wilderness, what we would call the wilderness. And back in those days, there was a lot of land that nobody owned. I don't think there is any of that anymore, but go back with me to the 17th century and the 18th century. There was a lot of land that those guys called the commons. But our bodies don't belong to anybody but us. And this is what he said. He said, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This no body has any right to but himself. I'm copying it right over. That's why the weird capitalizations and stuff. And I'm not gender neutralizing any of it. This is Locke, unadulterated. So back to me now. Therefore, anything we mingle our labor with, we own as our own private property. If I go out into the commons and grab something and fashion it with my body into something, that something becomes mine. My grandfather was a wood carver, and he made this wooden man that is on my desk, this cool little statue. So he got a piece of wood from the commons and he carved it into this, and then it became his private property. And now it's mine. That's how private property works, according to Locke. He goes on, the labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state of nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it, it hath by his labor something annexed or added to it that excludes the common right of other men. Are you with me? This is huge. Nobody had ever talked about private property quite like this before. So in my little example, if I go into the wilderness, cut down a tree, and fashion the wood into a violin, I own the violin. It is mine. It is my private property because I used my body to build it. And it is, in effect, an extension of my body and my mind. And I own my body. And in the 18th century, there was a lot of talk about property in this sense, property in one's own labor, property in one's own time, property in one's own thoughts, property in one's own decisions, especially regarding one's body. For white people anyway, not for slaves, right? Sometimes important to say the quiet parts out loud. So this invention of this institution of private property, which is not a universal idea, right? It was a very specific Western idea. It came out of the Age of Reason. The Enlightenment came from John Locke's pen, largely. This influential idea became the central pillar of capitalism, as envisioned just a little bit later and codified by Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations and other works. And it was a novel and radical idea. It's not widely known throughout indigenous culture. In most indigenous cultures, they don't have this concept of private property. There's just, these are our tools, and these are our cooking utensils, and these are our shelters. And what do you mean private property? It is not a core value throughout medieval culture either. Well, the king just owned everything. But it is a core principle of modernity, isn't it? This business of private ownership. Now, I'm not here to tease open a big economic argument. We're going to use this idea and bring it into our conversation about abortion. So Locke's essential starting point, his unimpeachable principle, you heard it go by pretty quickly, his self-evident claim that we and we alone own our bodies. No one else does, not other people, and surely not the state. Though through Thomas Jefferson, Locke's idea of personal autonomy and liberty becomes central to the American experience. In fact, you even heard in the 14th Amendment a few slides ago, life, liberty, and property, which is exactly a quote of John Locke. The Declaration of Independence says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For some reason, Jefferson removed the property thing. I'm sure a historian could explain to us why, but I'm not that person. But the 14th Amendment recovered it and put it in. So that we have a right to life, liberty, and property. Yeah, what I just said. So now what? Let's bring this around. Abortion and women's bodily autonomy. If, as Locke argues, we own our own bodies and no one else does, then how does this assertion impact abortion? Isn't the fetus made from elements from the commons? The carbon-based molecules of nature, of the earth. We're all made up of the elements of the earth. None of us manufacture our own bodies. It comes from the food we eat and this replication of cells of our own body. So the fetus is made inside of the woman from parts of her own body and her energy, and it undergoes its own development. And it certainly is mingled with the woman's labor. I mean, we even call it labor when you go into birth. And any pregnant woman will tell you being pregnant is its own arduous labor. Does not a woman's bodily autonomy extend to the tissues inside her uterus? Those opposed to abortion disagree with Locke and his legacy of liberty. For them, at the moment of conception, I'll say it again, I was already on an earlier slide, but just to be as clear as I can here with these sort of slippery ideas. For them, at the moment of conception, those who oppose abortion, for them, at the moment of conception, a woman no longer owns her own body or has autonomy over its internal processes. What a curious position. And I never hear people talking about it in exactly these terms. Until the baby is born, they argue, the pregnant person must be compelled by law to give birth, even if they are a 10-year-old girl and the victim of child rape, as happened some months ago last summer. That 10-year-old girl had to get smuggled out. Was it Ohio and go into Indiana, or the other way around? I forget now. There's so many of these cases. This 10-year-old girl had been raped by a 27-year-old man, had become pregnant, and it was illegal for that child to get an abortion because so strong was the belief that the fetus's rights trumped everything else. And to some of us, that's a sort of bizarre and monstrous read of what right and wrong is. So folks in favor of abortion access find this position self-contradictory. If the Constitution protects the liberty of individuals, then surely the adult woman's liberty rights cannot be so easily jettisoned. Otherwise, you run the risk of turning an entire category of human beings, women, into little more than breeding animals with the same rights as livestock. And some of you may feel I'm putting this in intentionally heated terms, but I'm really trying to just practice what Confucius called the rectification of names and call things what they actually are. It's too late now for sugarcoating. It's too late now for euphemisms. It's too late now for protecting people's tender sensitivities. I'm fascinated how the religious right has so quickly abandoned personal liberty, which used to be such a huge deal. You hear it to this day, right? So to me, these are the key questions. Is the claim that a zygote or a fetus is a fully human person a scientific claim or a religious one? Do men and women have autonomy over their own bodily processes in all cases? In all cases, including so much thinking that so many of us are doing now about transitioning, gender transition. If we don't own our own bodies, then what does liberty even mean? 61% of Americans say that abortion should be legal in all or most cases, and 37% say that abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. Those against abortion overwhelmingly cite religious doctrines as a source of their opposition. That's key, and that's also from the Pew research, the Pew polling. When you ask people who oppose abortion why, they cite religion. I guess you have to, because there's no scientific basis for that position. Isn't opposition to abortion a personal religious belief that, according to the First Amendment, cannot be codified into law, especially when it violates the liberty of so many? Does the state have the right to compel free people to live by the religious beliefs of minority sects? Is minority rule a justifiable political principle? And I'll tell you what people on the religious right will say to that question, because they're not dumb, right? They can read the Pew Research poll and all the other polls just as well as you and I can. What do people who are excited about the restrictions of abortion access, what do they say? They will tell you to your face, I don't care. I don't care if we're a minority position. And for some of us, that makes our blood kind of turn cold. And that's what some of us mean by, is this the end of democracy? And the coming of something else, call it fascism, call it theocracy, the rule of religion. Majority control still has to mean something, given the checks and balances of our electoral system and the other rational limitations. Nobody wants mob rule. We'll debate the Electoral College some other time. But you might think that you could rally everybody around a principle like one person, one vote, and we should do whatever the majority wants, but that America no longer exists. You cannot rally everybody around those two seemingly unimpeachable principles from my childhood. Everybody, one person, one vote, and majority rules. That is no longer a value that has power or priority on the religious right. They're interested in establishing, and they will say it, that's why we call them sometimes Christian nationalists. Marjorie Taylor Greene proudly calls herself a Christian nationalist. Tucker Carlson gets on and talks in Christian nationalist terms every night on the highest rated news channel in the United States. A lot of people are being taken in by this view that we're not that interested in majority rule anymore. We want to do what our God tells us to do. which basically is what our ministers are telling us to do. So these questions, and this is just sort of summing up everything we've gone over in the last 45 minutes, these questions and many others, and I hope we get into them in our dialogue here, are the questions that arise when one enters into an inquiry into the philosophy of abortion. So what's next? I don't know. I threw away my crystal ball when Donald Trump came down the escalator. I don't know. I never know what's going to happen anymore. I thought I lived in one country, and it turned out I lived in a different one that I wasn't paying enough attention to. And I'm very optimistic, though. I want to be clear with you. Some of you probably have found some of the things we've been discussing tonight troubling. But ultimately, I'm optimistic. There are always pendulum swings in political fortunes. I work with very young people as a community college professor. Yeah, they don't vote, but they will soon when they get a little bit older. And they're pretty amazing. And they have a kind of empathy and wakefulness that I did not have when I was 19. And so I think we're going to be all right. And this is just me sort of guessing. I just told you I didn't have a crystal ball, and now I'm telling you we're going to be all right. I don't know if we're going to be all right, but I have this feeling, and I bet some of you are with me on this, that no matter how dark things seem to get, or how irrational they seem to get, or no matter how much our taken for granted liberties are kind of vanishing in front of our face, we saw what happened in the last few election cycles. People just aren't having it. They just aren't having it. We saw what happened in Kansas. We saw what happened in the recent midterms. I'm fascinated by what's going to happen in the upcoming presidential campaigns. And here in California, we always kind of know what we're going to get because we're just an insanely blue state. You know, I think Donald Trump got about 28% of the vote in California back in 2016, which meant millions of Californians voted for him. But because of the Electoral College, all of the we have a winner-take-all state as our 48 states. So all of California Electoral College votes went to the Biden-Harris ticket. And those 3 million, 8 million, I forget, Californians, mostly in the Central Valley. I have a bunch of relatives up there that voted for Donald Trump. You know, the place where Kevin McCarthy and Devin Nunes are from. Those places, Bakersfield, Fresno. Yeah. Trump country. And their vote got erased because of the Electoral College system. So it's institutions like that the framers of the Constitution, Madison, and what's the guy they wrote the musical about, Hamilton, they put those in because they wanted to protect us from sheer majority rule. So like I said, we'll discuss the Electoral College some other day. But what's next is a lot of people like us are kind of waking up to the situation and talking about it in increasingly powerful ways. So I will stop sharing here and I will go back to, let's see, let me unpin myself. And that way, oh, I think it's the spotlight thing. So Tony, why don't you unspotlight me? And then then I won't be like the big face on the screen. And we'll.
Oh, should be done now.
Okay, thank you. Good. So, as Tony said before, if you want to, and I hope you do, have a comment or a question. Oh, good. We have a couple already, Laura. Fantastic. Let's just keep that going. I think most of you know how to use the hand raising function. Again, if you're not sure, I'm pointing at it on my screen. It's that reactions, that smiley face with the plus sign. Click on him, her, and them, they, and then you see the raise hand button, and that's how you do it. And then you'll fly into the queue, and we can go from there. And I will start up. So, Tony, should I facilitate this, or would you like to? Jan, anybody else?
I mean, I think you're more than capable to do that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm happy to do it. So, Laura, please Welcome, and what's your comment or your question?
Yeah, you were saying that we're talking about this in increasingly powerful ways, and you also had commented on how divisive the country has gotten. And I keep imagining that the really productive way to talk about anything, especially contentious issues, is to find common ground or find compromise. Does that seem realistic to you? Is that something that, that you're even hoping for?
I agree with you, and this, I kind of learned this over the last 5 years of the anti-racism work that so many of us have been doing. So many of us white people who have, tried to learn a little bit more about being allies and finding common ground with racism deniers. Let's call them that. 55% of white Americans who believe that there is no more racism, that we don't have a racism problem, or believe that they themselves are the victims of what they like to call reverse racism and so on. So all these like deep misunderstandings. So how do you dialogue with people who don't even think that racism is real? And you're absolutely right. For me, it always starts with you've got to find in conversation that place where you empathize with each other. And so where can we find that with people who want to ban abortion, who believe that women at the moment of conception lose all of their bodily autonomy? I doubt they ever put it that way, but probably don't want to hit them with all that in the first moment of your conversation. And so what could we do? How about that everybody loves life, and everybody loves families, and everybody loves children, and everybody loves women and men, and that we ought to work somehow to create systems where all of those things are protected and all of those things are honored and the dignity of life is honored. And maybe that's a starting point, but as I try to struggle to articulate these things, that doesn't sound like much. And I don't know where to go from there. So perhaps it would be helpful to bring up the question of liberty. Some of these same folks, I'll bring up Ron DeSantis for an example, and so many of his supporters in Florida who talk a lot about liberty, and they talk a lot about freedom from the government. Jim Jordan, for example, who talks a lot about liberty and freedom, and how that Anthony Fauci was the enemy because he was stealing liberty and freedom from Americans by making them get vaccinated or by making them wear masks. So a lot of the same folks who oppose abortion access talk a lot about liberty, and they talk a lot about their bodily autonomy to not wear a mask, to not have injections put in them. And yet, maybe there's a way to point out to them that when a 10-year-old girl becomes pregnant, what about her liberty? And so maybe that's a starting place, Laura. I don't know. That's a really good question. Thanks. Yeah, and so lower your hand when you're done, and then we'll just keep this going. Lisa, I see you. Hello. I should have called on you first.
That's all right. Hi.
Hi.
Amazing presentation. It was hard for me to keep all of that frustration and anger in check, but a lot of good points to think about. But what kept going through my head was, with this 70 or 60-30 split, these statistics,
Yeah.
and me just finishing up a statistics course in sociology for my degree. Where's the man-woman angle on this vote? I mean, is it predominantly men? And if so, is it because there's really no empathy and understanding about a woman owning her body, and they're hiding behind the religion or other reasons? That just came to mind. Where does that factor in?
Great question, and it's the right question. I don't have that data, and the data that I was looking at was not aggregated by gender. I suppose the assumption there being keeping the article shorter and more readable, and also women and men vote, so it was just like looking at what voters sort of thought. But that is a great question. And you and I, it sounds like, might have our suspicions about how that might break down, and that it would be a more male-centric position. And boy, is that a complex issue as well. I'm reminded of the quip, the oft-heard quip that if men got pregnant, it would be abortion would be a sacrament, and they would be free at every ATM. I'll just keep going. So but the fact that the opposite is happening, that the restrictions are getting tighter and tighter from, let's face it, largely male politicians in a blatantly patriarchal system, from a religious community, the evangelical community, that believes that women are subservient to men. I mean, they say it in their liturgy. They say it in their credo. This isn't I'm not reading the tea leaves here. This is what they say, that women should be silent and they should serve their men, and men should be lords of the house. And do you think that doesn't end up on the floor of the State House in South Carolina? Come on. And so we are dealing with an encroaching theocracy, it seems to me, that is patriarchal and male-centric. So these are some of the threads that are so difficult to untie, because when you push back on those positions, they will squeal, religious liberty, religious liberty, religious liberty. You can't take from me my religion, even though I'm using my religion to take from you your bodily autonomy. And how do we do better at shining light on that without making them feel like we're attacking them? I don't know. Patty Bates Valerie. Hi.
Hi. Hi. I know.
Yeah, good. Save us.
So I'm a Peter Bolland groupie, and I follow you around wherever I can online.
Thank you.
I'm in Dallas at the First Unitarian Church in Dallas. And so we have been working, a small group of us have been working on developing a series of workshops that really get into how to have these difficult conversations across differences. And so we've been looking a lot at the information that comes out from the Constructive Dialogue Institute, which is relies a lot on the work of Jonathan Haidt. And so I'm sure, Peter, you're familiar with those. He identifies these 6 moral traditions, and one of them is liberty, and you touched on that. But what I think gets in the way in this issue is another one that is really, really high for conservatives is sanctity. And so there's 6 of them, and they've done all this research that shows we all have all 6, but liberals tend to have a higher interest or commitment to care, equity, and one other. And then there's sanctity, liberty, and authority. And conservatives tend to be higher on those. And so there's just a lot of work being done. There's a lot of work being done on how to have these conversations. So we're pulling from a lot of different places, but that's one of the big places we're pulling from is Constructive Dialogue Institute. And the other one that they rely on too, and I think this is like the secret sauce of it all, is called the Deep Canvassing Institute. And so much of the work is being done in California, and it's about storytelling. So it's not so much about facts. It's not so much about, not even relying as much on the values as it is on telling stories. And so I just know for me, when I was young and I thought about abortion, I thought it didn't sound too good. Didn't really sound like a great idea to me.
Right.
But as I began to hear women's stories, that's what kind of started me thinking. And now I'm in Texas. Well, I've been in Texas most of my life. And hearing the women's stories here in Texas of what is going on with them, and they're being made to wait until they go into sepsis, even though they needed an abortion days ago. And just hearing those stories, and even, some of them have shifted their own beliefs in the process because it occurred, it happened to them. So I really think that's where we have to be thinking about is figuring out, and so I just came here from another webinar on how to tell good stories. And because it's not necessarily a skill that we're all born with. It's just how to tell a compelling story that's short, that really makes the point. And so all of that stuff is what we're working on. And I think eventually our goal is to share it with other UU congregations once we get it, once we get it going here in Dallas. But the short answer is recognizing that we do have the same moral traditions, but they have different priorities. We put different priorities on them, and then figuring out how to tell stories to help people see something that they're not going to listen to the facts, right? But we all do tend to respond pretty well to stories.
Oh, thank you for that, Patty. No, that's so good. So thanks for checking in from the heart of Texas. That is really, y'all have a big context that a lot of us have been watching, of course, for years. And to be in the middle of that community and to be working on the things that you're working on, I can't agree with you more about the storytelling piece. I think that is kind of an answer to that first question that came up, like what can we do to find that middle ground? I kind of said something about, trying to find empathy for each other, but the way you find empathy is through these stories. And I think I've been more moved on my whole journey through this issue through the years, not by demographics and studies or even reasoned arguments, but by those stories. A lot of us followed very closely this 10-year-old girl who was being forced to give birth in her home state and had to be smuggled out to a physician in a neighboring state. And then the attorney general of her state tried to prosecute this physician in another state. I mean, the long arm of the law, and we hear all these cases, the so-called vigilante law in Texas, where the Uber driver who drives someone, can be successfully sued, not by the state, but by me, some random person out of the public. So these are strange times, but those stories break our hearts. And then suddenly we begin to reorder and reassess our previously held positions. And that's possible for anyone. So that's a really, that's sign for optimism, it seems to me. But
can I just
yeah,
mention
sure.
two
Come
really
back.
quick more things? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
One other book that I think is so valuable. It's a new book called The Persuaders by Anand Giridharadas. And 2 points that he makes, and you can find his video interviews. You don't have to buy the book. He makes a really important point that where people hold these positions, we don't always so sure about them. We decide, we make a decision, this is my position, but then there's uncertainty under that. And so we should always remember that someone who says has this position or that position, they may not be as strong on that. And that's deep canvassing does that too. They ask people, well, from 1 to 10, how important this is to you. And then the other thing is that he talks about is that people do change their minds all the time. Yeah. And it is through the stories, but it is this something we have to remember, that people change their minds. And so it gives me hope to do this work.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Tony, hi, I see your hand.
Hi. So I'm thinking about this question of it being a religious question, right? That at the heart, it is a religious opinion. And so as a staff, actually before staff meeting, we were just having a conversation this week about several of the words we use to define ourselves. We use church and we use faith, like we're clearly a religious organization. And this topic, amongst others of sort of the political hot potatoes, came up. And so on one hand, I feel like as people who are in a church and people of a faith, of a liberal tradition, we have the ability to sort of respond to other more conservative faiths and say, well, like a woman's bodily autonomy is as much a tenet of our faith as a fetus's bodily autonomy may be a tenet of your faith, and sort of engage with them in that way. On the other hand, I am also aware that then that sort of it affirms their presumption, right? That this is a religious argument, and now we're having a religious argument about a secular law. And I'm not sure which is the more powerful tool, or whether, whether that's just going to open a whole nother can of worms and make it okay to just start having religious conversations in the public forum, or whether that is also maybe a powerful comeback to that this, okay, if you're going to insist this is a religious argument, then it really means everybody's religion. I just wonder which.
That's an interesting way to frame it. That is, I can see why now that it makes its own kind of trouble when you frame it as a religious assertion, a religious position. The reason I brought it up, that particular line of framing or reasoning, was because of the First Amendment, and that of course different sect communities, different denominations, different spiritual communities can have a whole range of different theological positions, political positions. All that's protected speech, but you get into the red zone when one group gains enough political power to impose their particular religious view on the majority. And so to me, it only becomes important when you mix it together with political power. So when the Unitarians take over the country and start forcing us all to, and to make us all question the divinity of Christ or whatever, and that's a really different discussion, isn't it? Than just Unitarians having their position about the divinity of Christ, which doesn't even represent what all Unitarians think anyway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it, to me, is really about political power mostly, and not. I was just trying to assert, I don't know if I'm successful or not, that the claim that a zygote is a person is not a scientific claim, it's a religious claim. And if I get at least that established, and I try to, I don't know if I'm successful, but I try to say that it's a tenet of faith, then I feel like the First Amendment starts to really become important. And the Bill of Rights is kind of a big deal to conservatives. Usually they love the Second Amendment. So I guess I would leave that there, but yeah, good luck. Thanks, Tony. Would anyone else? Oh, Ellen, sure. You want to do the physical hand raise? I see you there. Jump in. Turn your mic on. Oh, you're on.
Now, this is just one instance where I probably was not the reason this person changed their mind, but I'm also thinking, like with Tony's thing, it's getting into that, dichotomy type of thing, the woman versus the zygote and so forth. My uncle changed his mind about abortion, not because of what I said, but over a period of time. He went from being a religious Jew to an atheist. And somehow Judaism, as you pointed out, Peter, does not make you anti-access to abortion, but he tended to lean that way. Mm-hmm. What I said to him, and I think there's stories that would speak to the person who's putting that supposed life that's inside a woman and is trumping the woman's liberty and health care. If one can make a point about agreeing with and not denying a fetus's, not going there, but just what I said to my uncle was, what is the fate of an unwanted child? And I'm sure there are stories that would be examples, you know, news stories, just like the 10-year-old girl, of how an unwanted child can be brought into a hellish existence. At any rate, what he said when I said, what about the unwanted child and what their life is going to be like? He said, you know, I never thought of that. So, you know, it's just a way not to make it a either or and make them bad because they have the feeling about the life of the zygote, which,
Yes.
you know, anyway, it's just another way to think about how you can bring someone to a different way of looking at
Yeah.
what they're saying, you know, what they believe, a different way of looking at it.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, that's a really good example of just asking great questions and just inviting people into an inquiry. Look, I'm not here to beat you up about what you think. In fact, I don't even really know exactly what I think. And I've been through that journey too, Norm. I see you. Just we'll get to you right now. But that's where people often go, is like, but this is going to be a person. This fetus is going to develop into a person. And I guess personally, and I've tried not to talk about my own views, I'm sure they're coming through loud and clear anyway, but I think in my own evolution around this issue, it's like, yeah, this fetus is, if everything goes right, going to turn into a human being eventually. But when you're comparing it to the liberty rights of the woman who was already an upright, breathing, walking around, fully fledged human being, citizen of the United States, granted all of the rights by the 14th Amendment, and don't her liberty rights still outweigh whatever liberty rights a 6-week-old fetus might have, a 10-week fetus, whatever. And especially in all those subcategory nuanced considerations. So to me, it's not a cut and dried thing, a black and white thing, but in the nuanced messiness of life and in the gradient scales that separate things, it seems like we ought to err on the side of the liberty of adult human beings. And so that's the trade-off, I guess, I'm willing to make. And besides, it isn't my decision to make. And that's another important piece for me. I'm not the boss of anybody, and I will never be pregnant. And so it sometimes feels like I shouldn't even be given a voice in this. So that's part of my chaos around this issue as well. Norma, hi, come on in.
I guess my question is, it's great to try to have that conversation and do stories one-on-one. But to me, where do we go right now from the politicians, and how do we go there? How come we're not going there to resolve and to, you know, debate some of these issues with the elected officials? I mean, I came from Texas. I'm sorry for the people that had to go there. I came from Texas during a period when Republicans didn't even want to support the WIC program. And I was part of the process of, from the financial end, you know, even though they, you know, said, we don't want, you know, the feds in our backyard, we, you know, and I testified every year at how the allocation of WIC monies was made available based on infant mortality. And but what I'm looking for is, how do we hold politicians, the people that, whether I voted for them or not, they, you know, I am their constituent. How do we approach them? And, you know, and I'm 72, so I'm going, how can I direct young people who tend to be very angry in masses to direct themselves to those elected officials? Because if not, I'm kind of also waiting to saying, I don't know what next to do.
That was really well said, and I think a lot of us feel that same kind of powerlessness, and it's difficult to see how to wrest power away from people who have it. What's that line from Martin Luther King in his letter from a Birmingham jail, that, you know, the history of a world shows very clearly that the people who have power never give it up willingly. It has to be taken. And it has to be taken, in King's mind, nonviolently and through democratic institutional processes. And so just to continue to speak at those and testify in the ways that you did, and also support people on the ground. You know, I can't be everywhere all at once. There are amazing people in Texas, in Alabama, in Arkansas, and in South Carolina and Florida. I talk to them. I know a lot of you do too. And there are grassroots movements in all of these places of people who are much more horrified than we are by what's happening there, because they're living through it in their own communities. Books are getting banned from their own kids' schools. And so there's I don't think this particular wave of conservatism, of theocracy, is going to go unscathed. I think the red wave that did not materialize with a Democratic presidency in the White House, the Republicans were supposed to win everything in the midterms in November, and it didn't happen, not even close. And so that's another piece of evidence that people are just not having it. We don't see it in the news, because every time I turn on the TV, there's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan screaming about something. But in the real world, and I'm not blaming the media, because that makes pretty good TV. I don't blame them for putting people like that on TV. But in the real world, there are a lot of people doing a lot of amazing things to disempower those voices, to move those districts around, to fight gerrymandering, to turn states increasingly blue. Look what happened in Pennsylvania. And there are a number of other states that get closer and closer to purple. And maybe we're going to see that accelerate because of these increasing restrictions on abortion. What was that phrase a lot of people used last summer when they were describing what are Republicans going to do now? They're like the car. They're like the dog that caught the car. You ever heard that joke? You know, the dogs that chase the car. Well, the dog caught the car. Now what? Okay, you're outlawing abortion. Now watch what we're going to do. And so maybe that's something that is unfolding as we speak. But you're right. Those people are in power. They're going to be in power for years, and a few years longer anyway. But a lot of people lost in November. A lot of election deniers lost, even in places like Arizona. So to me, those are like kind of glimmers of hope that make me optimistic. And I try to acknowledge the reality while also staying hopeful. I hope that helps. And thanks for doing all that work, Norma, that you did, that you referred to. I'm looking at the chat because some people are putting some data there. Also Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan initiatives. Right. All of that happened summer, and Wisconsin. Important Supreme Court election coming up on April 4th. So yeah, things are really moving. This is going to be a pretty, if you follow politics like I do, it's going to be pretty sexy these next couple of years. It's going to be fun. And let's have some other questions or comments or stories from, okay, Barbara, please come on in, unmute.
Yeah, I want to thank you for the extended analysis of it, because my visceral reaction to it was exactly what you wound up through your analysis, which is the 2 points, which is religious imposition and autonomy over my own body. And I'm 72. I'm not going to have a kid now, but just to think that half of Americans potentially don't, that people want half of the people in America to not have autonomy over their own body. And it just makes me furious as a woman. So those 2 points are the biggest for me. And I'm seeing that the Supreme Court is sort of, it's moving away from separating religion from the state. It's in fact, the Supreme Court almost seems like a religious body imposing, it's like the Sharia law on us, only it's whatever their belief is. So anyway, that maybe you might have some thoughts about that separation of church and state, even though I'm a Unitarian. So I just feel like my religion is being imposed upon by these people. It's not religious freedom for me. And that's what it's all supposed to be about. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Yeah, I think you and I are alike in that regard. That's what hit me viscerally. And I guess it's redundant if I say, just like in a really physical way, I felt sort of physically afraid and angry and astonished that people in leadership, I mean, I get it if the guy down the street holds that view, but that people in leadership, people in the Supreme Court who would be willing to hold those views, it kind of frightened me a little bit, because I thought, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, I kind of thought I lived in one country, but then it became clear after a few years that I actually lived in a quite distinctly different place than I thought I did. And that makes me, after I get over the rage and the alienation and I come back around and try not to hate people that disagree with me and all that stuff. And that's all my inner work that I have to do. But once I get sort of past most of that, I then am still left in the shock that seemingly bright people can have such profound disagreements over such a basic value or principle as bodily autonomy. They pretend to not even understand what that word means. Bodily autonomy, that's just more lib nonsense or something. It's like, and the last thing I want to do is launch into a John Locke lecture, because these are the same people that love private property, right? and all of those things. So I don't know where the hook is that I can kind of make the case that might make them see. So I think all of your suggestions today have been very helpful about combining all of these things together, learning how to talk across ideological divides, and doing that through the heart, through story, through the cultivation of empathy. Empathy really is the answer, but it's difficult to impose empathy on people who are unwilling to open to it. But as soon as I say those words, I think, you know what, damn it, everybody's open to feelings. You just have to tell the right story. Nobody's permanently closed off. It seems that sometimes people lack empathy. How can you put Panamanian immigrants on a bus, promising to take on a plane, promising to send them somewhere good, when you're just using, and then you send them to Martha's Vineyard in a political stunt? That's the consciousness of the political mind that we're kind of dealing with, in Governor DeSantis, who is probably not going to be our next president. He won't survive this primary, but that voice is still out there. And that is, after I get over my shock that position even exists, I then sort of work my way back around to, okay, You know what's a little closer to home? My brother, who is a Mormon. He's 10 years older than me. I love him. He's an amazing man. We're close, but we're the opposites religiously and politically. And he voted for Donald Trump because he wanted, he knew Trump was a sort of a despicable person, but he didn't have any fondness for Hillary Clinton. And he said, Peter, as a Mormon, we believe that the U.S. Constitution is a divinely inspired document and that God chose the United States of America to be his divine kingdom. And that when Jesus returns, he's coming to Salt Lake City. I mean, it just all spools out from there, right? And that we want the Supreme Court because we want to overturn gay marriage, as he calls it, and we want to overturn abortion. And these things are demonizing our country. And I'll vote for a turnip if that turnip is going to appoint the Supreme Court justices that I want them to appoint. And I have great grief over his beliefs, and he is completely shocked by mine. And we go through some times when we don't talk, but you know, he's a really good dude, and I guess I'll humanize it this way: he's scared. And I don't mean to patronize my older brother and pretend to psychoanalyze him. And God forbid he ever hears this recording, but you know, he's afraid. He spent 40 years in a law enforcement career. And there's all kinds of different people in law enforcement. I'm not generalizing, but for him, you know, being in law enforcement doesn't exactly help you view humanity as a benign entity. And so, you know, he lives in a world of black and white where there is danger, and he believes that Satan is real and that Satan is doing things actively to destroy our heavenly kingdom, and those forces have to be opposed. And so what am I going to do with that? You know, those beliefs of this overarching metaphysical evil that must be opposed politically in every way possible. So vote for Donald Trump. And I'll be damned. Eric, my brother, he won. He got 3 Supreme Court justices. He likes Trump less now than he ever did, but it's like one of those devil's bargains. He had to kind of say yes to that. And we'll see what happens with this next election cycle. It looks like President Trump is probably going to prevail and be up for president of the United States again. And all of those people are going to vote for him again for the same exact reason. And a lot of us who oppose those forces were dumbfoundedly shocked in 2016. I wonder what we're going to do about it this time, and not sit back and just kind of watch. So I'm sorry I got all political there, but you know, when you talk about these issues, it obviously we're talking about large civic institutional movements. And so how can you not talk about elections?
And on that note,
We're wrapping up. Okay.
I just want to thank you once again for such a rich discussion, such thoughtful and deep exploration of a very complex issue. Just done so well. So thank you, Peter Bolland.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for joining us. Keep a lookout for April. Our speaker is still to be announced, but if you take a look at our website or the window, you can sign up for the next one in April. And check out peterbolland.com for any of the other things that Peter is doing coming up soon.
And if I could just quickly interject, peterbolland.com again is where y'all can go right now and hit contact and drop me a note if you would like this PowerPoint, and I will email it to you. If you don't want the PowerPoint, then you don't have to do that. But that's how you do it, peterbolland.com.
So thank you all again, and I will stop the recording, and good night to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.